invite you to a great morning. We're looking forward to some exciting presentations. So glad you braved the weather to come out.
So we're hoping to record this, both of your sessions. So we have a clip.
Oh, you're kind of awesome.
And so that goes to the camera. So then if you want the portable clip, that'll go to the microphones of the room. You'll need to put that on.
Okay.
I know there's a couple of guys that are thinking right around that 2:30, 3 o'clock, they're getting nervous about getting home. So we're going to stay on schedule. So I've had these glasses on, and a couple of the guys told me that, you know, I can see better, but I still don't look very good, but I need them to read. So our first speaker this morning will be Dr. David Galligan from the University of Pennsylvania Vet Clinic. He's the director of the Center for Animal Health and Productivity, and his major interest is improving decision-making and the ability of consultants and producers to do better in the dairy industry. So we're going to welcome Dr. Galligan.
Oh, thanks.
Like I said, we're going to be snappy.
We're going to be snappy. We're going to be great. How about those Eagles? Yeah. Boy, life's complete now, right? It's been a long, long time. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And what I'm going to talk about are wealth creation opportunities for the dairy producer. Before I get into it, though, I want to go through what are the mega trends and challenges that are facing the dairy industry. And these are trends that are going to be there, I think they've been there for the last 20 years, they're going to be there for the next 40. One of the major things that I see happening is kind of the whole consumer area emerging. You know, when I sit at the vet school, we often have meetings and people are concerned about what type of disease outbreak might occur that might be devastating to the dairy industry. But sometimes we have to look beyond kind of disease issues to more subtle things that are happening. And I think one of the more subtle things that's happening is consumerism. Yes, there's a growing demand for animal protein, which is good for our industry. By the year 2030, another 2 to 3 billion people in the world are going to be moving into the middle class. And one of the first things that people buy when they get more money is animal products, milk and dairy and meat. So that's a good thing. But also there's growing concern in consumers about animal welfare issues. Is animal protein a part of a sustainable future diet? And so I think as an industry, all of us have to engage the public in those discussions and talk about what's valuable about animal products and how animals are a vital part of a sustainable future system. But the concern on antibiotic use and food safety is really real. And so I think while disease issues will be very obvious and what have you, this attitude towards animal products is something that we have to work on. And of course, the other thing that's happening is food is now traded globally. When I graduated from the vet school in '81, only about 2 to 3% of our milk value was shipped overseas. Now it's close to 14, 15%. So suddenly, changes that are occurring in, Turkey or Iran or whatever influence our milk price. Whereas that was never the case back in those early years. And so suddenly, a lot of what we see in terms of our current milk prices is a function of what's happening around the world. And that's not likely to change. The other concern, of course, is the environmental impact of animal production systems. And I think, we see that through the advent of different types of regulations emerging. And so that's going to be there into the future. One of the fortunate things that we've realized through a lot of our research is that the dairy industry has a wonderful legacy and history of efficiency. The efficiency of the industry is a model to other industries in terms of the amount of yield per animal that we now realize compared to earlier days when we had much lower yields and therefore had a bigger impact on the environment when you look at things on a per kilogram of milk basis. And the other trend that you've probably seen in Pennsylvania as well as the US is the consolidation that's happening. We're seeing more and more consolidation where herds are getting bigger. And this is, I have the opportunity to travel to China and India, the other big dairy countries of the world. And even in India, where the average herd size might be averaging 2 to 3 cows, they're actually seeing those producers go to 6 cows, to 10 cows. And so this concept of consolidation is occurring globally, and it's kind of unidirectional. In other words, once we go there, it's very unlikely that we're going to go back. And so that's a global trend we have to realize. And then I think the other is, of course, the emerging technologies. Now we have access to information on our iPhones, the weather, the prices, what's happening in the markets, which we never had before. And also we're becoming more intelligent in terms of how to make decisions. That's what we mean by BI, business intelligence. So our concepts and ability to take information and make it useful is very, very, it's accelerating. And then I think the other big mega trend that's hitting the dairy industry is the whole field of genomics. The ability to identify the right animals is becoming much better than it ever was before, and that's going to continue. So I think that's going to be a trend, a technology trend that's going to be very impactful. And so with these mega trends, of course, you as a dairy producer and owner have to decide what are your goals. And you know, when we look at this at the 60-foot level, up there, 60,000-foot level in the clouds, what have you, your goal is really to, first of all, protect your accumulated wealth. In other words, how do we make decisions to make sure that the wealth that I've already accumulated, my total assets on my farm, my land, my cows, what have you, that I protect it. And so that's a philosophy that we all have to embrace. And we do this by reacting to problems that occur on the dairy. So in the veterinary dimension, when the cow gets sick, you call the vet, so you're reacting to a problem. We do this from a historic perspective. When you look back at it, really the basis of this is you allow a problem to occur and then you react to it. And so it's very what we call reactive veterinary medicine. And so in the early days, this would be where the vet would say, hey, how's the cow doing? In other words, we're interested in what the biological health of that animal was. And that was our focus as a consultant to the dairy industry as a profession. But now what we're finding is that we need to have a different perspective. And the perspective we need to have is not only do we need to protect current wealth, but we have to identify opportunities to create new wealth. In other words, how do we grow? And so what this looks at is how do we be more entrepreneurial? In other words, how do we start to identify what am I going to change tomorrow that's going to improve my wealth collection in the future? All right? So looking at seeking opportunities rather than just solving problems. So that's a different kind of focus than what at least my profession has had in the past. And furthermore, we got to be better than average. We always got to be striving to be better than the average. And so what's happened is we've shifted from asking the question of how is your cow doing to how is your cow milking? In other words, when we ask that question, we're embracing the interest of the economic well-being of the producer. In other words, how are you able to grow against these mega trends that are occurring in the industry? And so our philosophy has changed from fixing problems to seeking out opportunities. So what are some of the attributes that we see successful managers doing? Well, first of all, they got to position the dairy to be flexible and resilient to these changes that are occurring. In other words, what strategies can you do on your farm that are dominant, that will allow you to withstand changes in feed prices, changes in milk, changes in the availability of labor? You have to be resilient and flexible. Systems that are very rigid are going to have trouble withstanding any type of perturbations that might occur in the industry. So we want the producer, the dairy operation to be resilient. And furthermore, you got to be ahead of looking at what changes are needed before you're actually forced to do it. In other words, there's always emerging technologies, animal management concepts that there'll be a segment of the industry that will embrace. There'll be the first timers, if you will, and And sometimes it's good to look and see what other people are doing and see if it works or fails. But you don't want to be too slow at embracing changes before suddenly you look around and you see, gee, everybody's doing this. They've been doing it for 5 years. Why aren't I? Okay, so be on the lookout for what changes do you need to embrace before you're actually forced to embrace them, because that's the norm of the industry. And you also have to learn, especially herds that start to get larger in terms of cow numbers, you have to also learn how not just to successfully manage cows, but how do you manage people, your employees. And we see that as a critical element. Many people who are attracted to being in the dairy industry came at it from the perspective of they like working with animals, like working with cows. And yet, at these larger and larger operations, you have to learn how to motivate people. How do you get the most out of your employees? You want every employee wanting to come to work on your operation. And it's more than just getting a paycheck. You want them to build into the spirit of the dairy, and those are going to be the types of people that are going to identify problems and help you seek opportunities. And so we always tell producers to hire for attitude and train for skills. In other words, attitude is everything. We can train people skill-wise, given a certain amount of time, but it's very difficult to change people's attitudes. You want a positive, contributory labor force. And the other thing is, as you start to manage more people, you want to be able to nurture success in other individuals. In other words, identify some of our most successful producers, when you walk around their farm, they're telling you stories about their employees. They're telling you successes that those employees brought to the farm. That, boy, this guy can manage the sand pits like nobody else can. And that you need that kind of, employees need that kind of acknowledgement, because then they'll build into the success of the overall operation. And then the other thing is to understand wealth creation metrics and strategies, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on here today. Is what are some metrics and what are some strategies? So I graduated in vet school in '81, so I'm starting to become an old timer. I'm one of the older faculty at the vet school, and when you leave vet school, you have a very narrow vision of what you think the problems are of the world and what you're going to solve. And so after being associated with the wonderful dairy industry for many, many years, I've kind of come up with two central themes that I've observed as being really, really critical. And to me, the overall dairy strategy is one where we need to pursue decisions or strategies that ultimately increase the dry matter intake of the milking herd, of the milking cow. In other words, we want them to eat as maximal amount of feed as possible, and we want to maximally partition that into milk. So everything we do, everything, from fans on the cows in the summer to good bedding to access to feed bunks to quality feed, quality forages in front of them, ultimately it's to increase the flow of nutrients through that animal. The actual production floor of the dairy then is the gut of the cow. And we want as much input going into that as possible. All right, so that's a tenet that as I listen to discussions about, hey, should we do investment A, B, C, D, I'm thinking in the background, how is this going to impact flow of nutrients through that cow's gut ultimately? How's that? And then, of course, the other big element out there is the whole heifer rearing strategy. And really, when you think about that, the heifers are really just a collection of feed, right? Collection of feed consumption over a 2-year period of time, so feed's in there as well. But there's such a big cost center on the dairy that they deserve their own attention. And so we'll talk a little bit about those as well. So just to reiterate some of the structural changes that have occurred in the industry, this is a slide showing the structure of the dairy herds in 1980. That's when I graduated from vet school in '81. Okay, and you can see that we had a predominant number of small herds. There was quite a number of, the blue is the herd size of 1 to 29 head. Really dominated the dairy industry. And of course, what's happened over time has been this reduction in the number of herds. This has affected my profession in terms of how many herds are going to employ us as vets when we go out. So we've seen a real consolidation, and of course what's happening is more and more of the operations are going into these larger and larger herds, and so that sliver there produces more than 50% of our milk now. Okay, all right, so if we look at where's the milk coming from, and so that little green bar of herds is producing now more than 50% of the total milk. And so when you translate that back to numbers of there's a small segment of maybe 5,000 to 7,000 cows that are producing maybe 60, 70% of our milk. All right, so that's a dominant force in the industry, and what we need to look at is how can we adopt some of the things that they've done to be successful at some of our smaller scaled operations. All right, but nevertheless, that's a trend out there. All right, so if we look at Pennsylvania, this is a study we did with the Center for Dairy Excellence several years ago, and we looked at milk production, rolling milk pounds per cow per year across different states. We saw this relationship to herd size. And at first, people would look at this and say, gee, boy, being large automatically means I'm going to make more milk. But really, when you think about it, really what large herds are really herds that were smaller herds in previous years that expanded. And that to be able to expand, right, you had to be successful. So I look at this and see really a opportunity curve where herds might have be at lower herd sizes, but become successful, and so suddenly I'm going to move from 50 cows to 80 cows, 80 cows to 100. So in other words, we march up that scale. And what's interesting is that this curve is very similar across all of these different regions. I mean, these are thousands of herds behind these data points, and yet we see very little difference between Pennsylvania, New York, and Wisconsin. There's some variance out here because of just the number of herds that we have at each of those levels. But nevertheless, there's this trend. And what I would suggest that basically is that successful managers really march up, so there's a filtering that occurs. Okay, and so I want to look at what are the decisions that these guys are making, how much of that can I bring into my farm. Okay, so what decisions, what's the criteria? Well, basically you want to create wealth, and you want to make decisions that accumulate assets of value, and then you want to own them. So in other words, I can expand my assets on a farm, right, by taking out more loans, but ultimately I want to own those assets, and that's what we mean when we talk about wealth. So what are the criteria for wealth creation? Well, of course it starts with the most fundamental investment, and the most fundamental investment on the farm is the cow herself. All right, you want to manage that cow as best as you possibly can, and that's one of the advantages that smaller herds have relative to larger herds, is the ability to do more individual animal management instead of looking at animals as a collective group. Okay, now there are trade-offs for that, but that's an opportunity in small herds that we have to really make sure we're taking advantage of. And so fundamentally, we want to manage the biology of the right cow, and by that I mean what her production, reproduction, welfare, and environment, in a manner that ensures economic viability of the operation and yet is sensitive to societal concerns. Now I put the word right in parentheses, and I've added that term to this slide more recently because there where I'm trying to capture is the whole concept of genetics, of making sure that we start with the right animal, and then we want to nurture that investment over time. Okay, and we want to do that in a manner that is economically rewarding to the producer, yet is aware of some of these societal issues. Okay, so looking at that cow, how do we make sure that she eats another pound of dry matter is going to be critical in terms of maximizing that investment. Now, as a veterinarian, we go to school and learn the biological life cycle of the cow, and you guys live this every day. Okay, we have conception occurring, and then we go through heifer rearing, and then the cow calves, and we go through maybe 2.9, 3 lactations, and then she's sold and we cull her. And basically every cow in the world goes through some phase of this, this life cycle. And of course, things can happen, right? The cow can die very early, can have not get bred back. Maybe they only give me 1 lactation. Some might give me 7 or 8. And so there are variations of this underlying biology. And of course, what we want to do is we want to manage this biology so that it maximizes the economic reward for producers. And so I think it's more convenient, rather than looking at the biological life of the cow, to look at it economically. All right? And so what I like to do is look at the cash flows associated with a cow over time. And so here, if we look on the x-axis, we have the age of the animal, all right, and in months. And here, the red is we're looking at monthly cash flows. So initially, we have a minus $100 investing in that animal. What would that be? This is where we're investing in semen, right? If we're buying $20 semen, might take 5 straws of semen to get a standing heifer. So automatically, before the animal's even born, you have an investment. And then, of course, we go through gestation, and then the animal is born and goes through heifer rearing. And so we start to accumulate cost. And so the blue line is the cumulative cost. All right? And so if that animal calves at 24 months, we might have accumulated, $1,500, $1,800 in cost. So what's the worst time for an animal to die on a farm? What would be the worst situation? It's right at that point where, wow, we've just invested all this money in her, and she has a difficult birth, and she's on the cull wagon, 5 days into lactation. Worst scenario outcome. Of course, what we'd like them to do is to come in and enter the lactation phase, okay? And so we see here that first lactation, so right away the investment starts with sire selection. How efficient are you at selecting your sires? Okay, are you using an algorithm? Are you using an optimization to purchase semen at the cheapest cost relative to the genetic gain? All right, and then the next phase is the heifer rearing. So how long is it taking you to rear a heifer? Are you at 22 months or 28 months? Herds and